listener production.
If he wins this election, our country doesn't have a chance, not even a chance, of coming out of this rut. We probably won't have a country left anymore. That's how bad it is. He is the worst in history by far.
How many billions of dollars do you owe in civil penalties for molesting a woman in public, of having sex with a porn star on the night while your wife was pregnant? I mean, what are you talking about? You have the morals of an alley cat.
That was US President Joe Biden and former US President Donald Trump in the first debate a short time ago, ahead of the election in November. I'm Bension Siebert and welcome to this special episode of The Briefing. Trump and Biden are pretty much neck and neck in the polls, and the stakes ahead of this presidential election couldn't be higher. For many Democrats, Donald Trump represents the end of American democracy, a dangerous autocrat, a threat to abortion rights, a threat to climate action, to the rule of law in the US. And for many Republicans, Joe Biden is an incompetent old man behind a huge wave of immigration into the US from the southern border, responsible for foreign wars and criminalizing his political opponent. Joining us to sort through all this in the US is the editor-in-chief of Raw Story, Dave Levinthal. Thanks again for joining us on The Briefing.
It's my pleasure.
So what stood out for you in this debate?
What stands out for many Americans, regardless of their political persuasions, which was the performance of the President of the United States, the current President of the United States, Joe Biden. By any measure, he had a disastrous performance. It would have been a really bad night for Donald Trump, but for Joe Biden. Donald Trump lied his way through this debate. He misled taxation policy. He had some strange answers about abortion that are likely to rile some in his Republican Party. And he played the hits for Donald Trump, talking about January 6th is something that he wasn't responsible for, and the list goes on and on. But Joe Biden at times just simply couldn't even articulate anything at all. He couldn't answer questions. He froze. He mumbled his words. He stumbled through this entire 90-minute long affair. And in the end here, Democrats are left, and I've been receiving text messages all evening, as have many reporters all across the country, from Democrats and Joe Biden supporters who are apoplectic. They are panicking, and they are worried that Joe Biden here and now at age 81 is nowhere even close to thinking about being president of the United States when he would be 86 years old in 2029 if he serves a full second term.
So Donald Trump is 78 years old. As you mentioned, Joe Biden, 81 years old. They are sort of considered in sort of different ways. The age question is a much bigger problem for Joe Biden than it seems to be for Donald Trump. But let's have a listen to one of the key moments where age was really an issue in this debate.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's destroying Medicare.
God, that was difficult to listen to, wasn't it?
It was difficult to listen to, and it was horrible for Democrats and shocking for a lot of Republicans, too, who didn't think that Joe Biden was going to have a performance that was as bad as it ultimately was. Let's remember that Joe Biden spent the better part of the last week in Camp David, which is a presidential hideaway away from Washington, D.C., preparing for this debate, relaxing, getting ready for it. And if under those circumstances, which are pretty good circumstances, Joe Biden comes up and stands mano a mano with Donald Trump and performs as he does, this not only just feeds into the Republican narrative that Joe Biden isn't up to the task, the very real question gets raised of, is Joe Biden truly up to the task of serving another 4 years as the American president, the leader of the free world, the man with literally his hands on the nuclear codes in a proverbial sense and an actual sense? It's very disconcerting for many, many Joe Biden supporters right now. And the question is being asked by some people, and this may seem alarmist to some, but not for others. Are we going to go into the national convention for Democrats in August in Chicago with Joe Biden truly winning the nomination at this point?
Do you think that Democrats have a great deal of choice? Obviously, with the Electoral College and the way that the system works, Joe Biden is the presumptive nominee, but you've had this disastrous moment here. Do you think that Democrats can really do anything before the election to change it?
This is really up to Joe Biden, and Joe Biden has had many opportunities over the past many years to say, I'm going to be a one-term president. I'm going to be a bridge to the future. I am going to be somebody who ends the era of Donald Trump, who stops MAGA Nation from overtaking this country, but then I will hand this over to somebody else who will represent that next generation. He chose not to do that. He very deliberately chose not to do it. Nobody pushed him into being president of the United States again for a second term, except for Joe Biden. He wants this. And it would take him deciding on his own, likely in conjunction with his wife, Jill Biden, who is really his closest advisor, bar none, to decide between now and that nominating convention that something was going to have to change. There is no indication, I should note, that anything is going to change, and that this will, for Joe Biden, perhaps be a speed bump, but still he is full speed ahead as fast as he may go toward the nomination and toward Election Day in November.
So let's talk about some of the major issues that were covered in the debate. There were many, including abortion, immigration, inflation, taxes, the war in Ukraine. Let's hear some of the pretty, I guess it's fair to say, extreme rhetoric that came from Donald Trump surrounding abortion.
But I believe in the exceptions for rape, incest, and the life of the mother. I think it's very important. The problem they have is they're radical because they will take the life of a child in the 8th month, the 9th month, and even after birth. After birth, if you look at the former governor of Virginia, he was willing to do this. He said, we'll put the baby aside and we'll determine what we do with the baby, meaning we'll kill the baby.
And here's what we heard from Joe Biden.
The idea that the politicians, that the founders wanted the politicians to be the ones making decisions about women's health is ridiculous. That's the last. No politician should be making that decision. A doctor should be making those decisions. That's how it should be run. That's what you're going to do. And if I'm elected, I'm going to restore Roe v. Wade.
With the politics of abortion so fraught in the US, who do you think had the message that had the broadest appeal?
Joe Biden likely won that on policy for two reasons. Number one, a majority of Americans generally agree with Joe Biden and generally agree that Roe v. Wade should be the law of the land or something pretty close to it. There are a lot of Republicans, though, and a lot of conservatives who aren't Republicans who believe that that shouldn't be the case and actually do very much like the way that things are today, where state by state by state, there are different laws that pertain to abortion. What is the rules of the road in Texas is very different than what are the rules of the road in California or Massachusetts or Florida. But what Donald Trump said about exceptions, that's something that people should pay a lot of attention to. This is somebody who called himself, and I paraphrase, the most pro-life president in history not long ago. So for him to say, well, hey, there's exceptions for rape and incest and the life of the mother, and I support the Supreme Court's recent decision to allow mifepristone, the abortion drug, to go forward. That's a huge, almost earth-shaking change in rhetoric for Donald Trump, at least in the ears of some of the most anti-abortion, pro-life Americans in the country right now. It will be curious to see how that plays with them, because chances are it's not going to play too well.
Of the other major issues that were covered, which do you think will affect American votes most?
So it seems trite to say, well, the economy, because you always say the economy, right? And it's always the number one issue. But the economy is a blanket, an umbrella for so many different aspects underneath it, that many of which got talked today. It's the stock market. It's jobs, it's kitchen table issues, and you can wrap in healthcare and medicine and prescription drugs and a whole variety of other things where people are, in essence, taking money in or they are putting money out. And taxation, I think, is very much a one that's a kissing cousin of the economy. And, you know, in that regard, people got a lot of red meat from both candidates, and people got actually a pretty darn good debate when it came to the two candidates going at each other. And at least even if some of the numbers were a little fudged on both sides or a lot fudged, it was an incredibly different kind of debate than what we could contrast it with, say, when Donald Trump and Joe Biden went head to head in a first Republican-Democrat presidential debate in 2020, when the two candidates were running against each other, where literally they were shouting over each other for the better part of 2 hours. This, because of the rules of this debate on CNN, was wildly different and noticeably different for people who had been paying attention. There was effectively no candidates shouting over each other because of the mics getting cut off. So when it came to a conversation about policy of any sort, be it the economy or something else, you did at least get some substance where you could hear both candidates and they could contrast with each other.
You wouldn't want to be a fact checker listening to this debate. There were many claims from Biden and Trump that were questionable or obviously false. There has been a lot of accusations of lying as well. Let's hear some of that.
Every single thing he said is a lie. Every single one.
I've never seen anybody lie like this guy. He lies. I've never seen it. He could look you in the face about so many other things, too. It's misinformation and disinformation. The losers and suckers story that he made up is a total lie on the military. It's a disgrace.
Do you think Americans trust either of these men?
Yeah, and it goes down to who you support. I think I think because you see it time and time again. The poll numbers show it the same. The people that you talk to who are supporters of one candidate or another, they in principle trust the candidate that they support, and they don't trust the other candidate that they don't support. There is very little deference given to the person that they don't like, and there is this shrinking middle where people still can be, oh, well, you know, I don't like Joe Biden, but I think he's an honorable man. I'm not crazy about Joe Biden, not going to vote for him, but I will give him the benefit of the doubt more than I won't. If we were having this conversation in, say, the 80s or the 90s, there would be so many more Americans who, on both sides, would feel that way toward a president. And these days, that hasn't gone extinct, but it feels like it's endangered. And it's endangered in a way that is kind of scary for the country, where the divide in this country is quite literally leading us to a point where the United States is tribalized, and you have your red and you have your blue, and neither the twain shall meet. And if you are in no person's land in the middle, then you're in a really odd place. There are some of those people again, but the numbers just aren't what they used to be, relatively speaking. Okay,
and Dave, just very briefly, because we're about to run out of time, what happens next? Is there going to be another debate before the election?
There's supposed to be another debate. It's supposed to be in September. It would be after the two national conventions, but we have those two national conventions to go through. And we didn't even talk about the fact that Donald Trump is a convicted felon, and he is going to be sentenced on 34 felony counts of business fraud. He has 3 other felony trials that are still in the offing here. Probably not going to happen necessarily before the election, but now questions with Joe Biden. Is he up to the task? Is there going to have to be some sort of last minute change? We are entering a much more interesting summer than we even thought it was going to be 2 hours ago, and that's saying a whole heck of a lot.
Absolutely. Put it in your diary. July 11th, I think, is when Trump will be sentenced. Thanks so much for your time, Dave.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dave Levinthal, Editor-in-Chief of Raw Story, joining us there. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. But if you liked what you heard, please share this episode with a friend. And that's not all we have for you this week. Antoinette Lattouf will join us with a very special guest. Antoinette, who are you chatting to for the weekend briefing?
My guest describes herself as having a voice that sounds like she gets into pub fights. But she was born in Finland despite her background being Chinese. You've probably come across her comedy on TikTok and Instagram, and she's now on Network 10's Taskmaster. We talk about her fascinating comedic career.
Thanks, Ant. I'm Bension Siebert. Thanks for listening. Speak to you soon.
Listener.